Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another CEN seminar. It's so lovely to see all of you here today. So today we are joined by Tehila Nugiel, who's going to be telling us about cognitive control as a supportive neurobiological mechanism for English learners. So just to tell you a little bit about Tehila, she's an assistant professor in the psychology department and neuroscience program at Florida State University. Her research broadly investigates how brain function and organization supports academic learning and attention in youth with a variety of experiences and developmental challenges. She received her PhD in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin, her BA in psychology from I should have checked how to say that one, Ramapo College, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Ramapo College of New Jersey, and before starting her lab at Florida State, Tehila completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. I'm really excited to hear from Tehila again. I had a preview of this talk at IMBES when she presented at a symposium, so I'm really excited to hear what you've got to tell us today. Take it away, Tehila.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to share some work and have a fun conversation about some of this. And yeah, if you happen to be at IMBIS, a lot of this will look familiar, but I've added a few kind of specifications, a few sort of problems I'm working through at the end as well, which I'm excited to chat about. So I'd like us to start today by thinking about a child in a classroom who wants to answer a question that their teacher posed. And so to do this, the child has to do a bunch of things, right? They have to potentially read off the board. They have to retrieve some knowledge, maybe compute an answer, hold that question and answer in mind, remember to raise their hand, ignore distracting stuff in their environment, and then if the teacher calls on them, they can complete this task. So you can imagine this goal requires a bunch of different things, right? It requires a pretty complex orchestration of different processes in order to be able to achieve the goal. So this is thinking about students pretty generally, but if we think about students who have particular developmental challenges, this orchestration of processes is going to be particularly taxing for them, right? So we can think about maybe students who have learning difficulties, maybe they are having trouble reading off the board, or maybe they have trouble computing that answer. We can also think about students who have attention difficulties, something like ADHD, where maybe they have trouble focusing on what the teacher is saying, or even trouble really staying in their seat. So in my lab, in my work, I think about these students a lot, right? I think about how we can better understand and support them. And I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so the lens I take to think about these students is through the brain. So understanding brain function, brain organization, how it relates to things like achievement and attention. And today I'm going to be really focusing on one particular lens I take, which is thinking about cognitive control and how the brain supports cognitive control and what that means for things like learning in different students. So when I talk about cognitive control, and I'll be talking about executive functions today as well, and I think we could probably spend this hour talking about different ways to think about and define cognitive control and executive functions. Today, I'm thinking about executive functions as sort of measurable, observable expressions or behaviors of cognitive control. And when we think of cognitive control, I'm thinking of higher order processes that really support goal-directed behavior. So some examples of executive functions and cognitive control, right? We could think about inhibition, so stopping yourself from doing some sort of prepotent response. We could think about flexibility, or you might call this shifting or switching, right? Being able to sort of direct our attention between one thing and another. You can also think about working memory falling under this umbrella, right? Holding information in mind, updating information in mind. And I'm sure we can imagine all of these are important for pretty much all of our daily tasks, and we could think of probably how they are supporting learning being in the classroom. Of course, when we think about studying these things in the lab, right, it doesn't look like this so much, more so looks like this, where we bring students, children in, and we have them do different tasks that really tap into these different aspects of cognitive control. And the toolkit that I use primarily is functional MRI. So I'll put students and kids in the scanner and have them do different control demanding tasks, different learning tasks, really again to understand how is control supported in the brain and what does that have to do with life outcomes. And for today, I'm going to be thinking about a particular group of students who have unique learning challenges, and these are English learners. So just to give you an outline of sort of where I'm going to be going today, I'm going to be talking about two studies examining cognitive control supporting learning in English learners. So we're going to be looking at a study looking at the brain during a control demanding task and how that engagement is related to learning. We're also going to be thinking about functional organization of the brain, right? Functional connectivity between systems that support control and systems that support learning, and what that has to do with their achievement as well. So I'm going to tell you what, I hope you feel like is a pretty nice story about the role of control and learning for this group of students. And then I'm going to flip it on its head a little bit and talk about some data that, points to specificity here, and, not just sort of being able to broadly say control is related to achievement all the time in all students. There's some nuance in that relationship. So we'll talk about some data suggesting some nuance there and some of our current thinking around that as well. So a lot of my talk today is going to be focused on English learners. So who are these students? And, this talk is, all my work is done in the United States. So this talk is very US centric. So something I'd be happy to hear about or chat about after I finish my talk is sort of what sort of English learners, what that experience looks like in the UK or other countries. But in the US, we define English learners as students who are unable to communicate fluently or learn effectively in English. And these students are primarily in English-speaking schools. And the reason that these students, for the most part, are given this label is because they come from non-English speaking homes and backgrounds. So they grow up speaking another language, they're matriculated into school in English, and they don't quite have that proficiency to really excel. ELs make up a pretty large number of students in public schools in the United States. About 10% of public school students have this EL label. And that's even higher. It's about 20% in Texas. And I mentioned Texas specifically because that is where a lot of the work today I'm going to be talking about was done while I was doing my PhD at UT Austin. So this group of students, they are well represented in Texas. Across the country, an overwhelming majority of these students come from Spanish-speaking backgrounds, so they grow up speaking Spanish. And this is, again, especially true in Texas, where almost all of the ELs in Texas are from Spanish-speaking homes and backgrounds. And they tend to be overrepresented in economically disadvantaged schools and neighborhoods. So we're thinking about students who not only have this particular challenge, but also tend to have fewer resources. So how are these students doing in school? So what I'm showing you here is national testing of reading data. And so I'll walk you through this a little bit so we have the sort of scaled reading score on the Y here. And then in the crosses, we have students who are not English learners. And in the circles, white circles, we have students who are English learners. And what really jumps out, right, is that year after year, there's this big gap between achievement in English learners versus their non-English learner peers. And in fact, when you sort of zoom in and look, so again, this is the same data. This is reading from 8th graders across the nation. When we look at English learners, we can see that their achievement is really pretty much on par with students with specific diagnosed disabilities. So their reading is quite matched. And I want to point out that both groups don't meet even what's thought of as basic reading achievement milestones for their grade. So when we think about how are English learners doing in school, in a word, they're not doing great. So I want us to think for a second about what are some of the unique challenges this group faces, right? So obviously they are going to school in their second language, which, by definition, they are not yet proficient in. As I mentioned already, they tend to come, on average, this isn't everyone, but tend to come from more economically disadvantaged backgrounds and have schools that have fewer resources. And another thing to think about is, not only are they not proficient in English, but a lot of them don't necessarily have a lot of exposure to English at home. Some of them, their parents don't speak any English. So the ability to kind of build those skills isn't always really there for those students. So given these sort of unique challenges, while these two groups are matched when it comes to their reading achievement, there are likely some pretty unique learning mechanisms going on for the English learners, right? That probably separate or differentiate them from just sort of other students who aren't performing well or other students who have formal diagnosed disabilities. And we can think about how this really shapes the brain, right? These unique learning mechanisms, their unique experiences are likely shaping their brain in specific ways. So the question that really drove the studies I'm talking about today is, how does the EL brain support learning? So when we think about this group, when we think about a label like English learner or bilingual, one thing I want to highlight is that these are really dimensional labels, right? You can have two people who have a label like EL or bilingual, but they might be quite different in terms of their use of language, their proficiency, their comfort in language. And we have data from this study showing this. So this is a group of English learners. They all come from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. They're middle schoolers. This is the group I'm going to be talking about today. And we can see that when it comes to things like the amount of English spoken throughout the day, right? We can see variability there, where there are some students who are speaking about half and half English. Likely those are students who might not be getting a lot of exposure to English at home. Some students speak more English throughout the day. But we can see when we look at that middle plot, right, there's a range in terms of proficiency in English as well as Spanish. So there's variability, right, in the kind of use and proficiency of language in this group. And we think that this variability is going to lead to some really remarkable individual differences in brain and behavior, particularly for the service of learning in English. So I want us to come back to think about cognitive control for a second and think about the role of cognitive control in learning. So we have lots of evidence that cognitive control is related to achievement. You can imagine the ability to direct your attention, hold information in mind that's going to relate to how you do in school. We have behavioral evidence that executive functions are related and predict academic achievement. And then we also have evidence from the brain that brain function, brain engagement is related to achievement as well. So some work from our group looked at canonical cognitive control networks. So we have in the purple and yellow here, networks, sets of brain regions that are known to kind of work together in concert during control demanding tasks. And we looked at brain function in these regions during a reading task. And when we pull out brain activity from the dorsoanterior cingulate, one of these control regions, and while readers, both struggling and non-struggling readers, are engaged in a reading task, we see that the way this control region is engaged is correlated with their reading achievement. So, and the pattern we're seeing is better reading, less engagement of control regions. So given we have this evidence, right, that both behaviorally and in the brain, control is related to achievement, we can imagine how this control might be particularly important for achievement in English learners, right? So you can imagine that the need to sort of switch back and forth potentially between doing something in your native proficient language and doing something in English for school in your less proficient language, that's going to drive control systems in a probably unique way. And if that's sort of what's going on daily during school, at home during homework, things like that, we think that these control systems might be driven in particularly relevant ways for learning in this group. So to examine this, I'm going to be talking about two studies. These studies were part of a larger study done by the Texas Center for Learning Disabilities, which is a NIH, which was an NIH-funded learning disabilities research center, takes place in Austin and Houston, Texas. And the design of the study, so it focused on middle school English learners who were from Central Texas, and they were all native Spanish speakers. The larger, broader study did an intervention for ELs that were identified also as struggling readers. I'm not going to be talking about the intervention at all. That was a different group who did that, and all of the data I'm going to be talking about today was collected before intervention. It's sort of a pre-intervention baseline time point. As part of that pre-intervention time point, they went into schools and identified English learners and measured their reading and math achievement. And then our group did, our sort of arm of the larger study was an fMRI study to specifically study brain function during academic and cognitive control tasks and see how this relates to learning in this group. And so, again, the question really broadly driving this work is, how does brain both engagement and organization relate to learning in English learners, with, again, a specific focus on those control systems. So to study learning, reading, math, and control in this group, we brought them in to our MRI center, and in the scanner, we had them do 3 different tasks. We had them do a reading task where they're looking at pairs of words, and one condition they have to decide whether the 2 words rhyme, and another one they have to just decide whether the 2 words are the same. We had them do a math task where they were given a math problem and asked to say whether or not the problem was correct. And then the domain of cognitive control we were tapping in this study is that flexibility or switching domain. So to get at this, we had them do a cued rule switching task. So they're presented with 2 rules, either shape or color. And one rule is highlighted. They're given 2 response choices, and then a target pops up. The rule disappears, the target pops up, and they have to match the target to the response choice based on the rule. And the rule is going to switch back and forth. So that's really what's going to drive that flexibility. So we can take these 3 tasks and we can map out sets of brain regions, right? Systems essentially that respond to reading, math, and control in this group. So the first study was really focused on that cognitive control flexibility task to see what does the brain engagement look like during this task, and does that engagement, do individual differences in that engagement relate to academic achievement in this group? So first of all, when they're doing this task, what does the brain look like? We can see that in a contrast of the task greater than fixation, we see really nice engagement of the control systems. So the hot colors are regions that are active for task greater than fixation. And if I bring up sort of the map of these cognitive control canonical brain systems, we can see that those are driven by this task, right? We see frontoparietal, dorsal anterior cingulate, insula. Essentially, the EL brain, while it's doing this control task, looks like we would expect it to. So we get nice control engagement here. But again, the question that we're really after here is, what does an individual's engagement during this task, how does that relate to their achievement? And so we correlated reading and math skills with activity during this task. And we find that reading skills are related to activity during the task. We see this both when we look at fluency as well as word reading. And we see a pattern of relationship here where better reading is less engagement of these control regions, or of these regions during the control task. We do see some sort of control regions coming out, sort of frontal, parietal, related to the reading skills. We also saw this relationship when related to math skills. The regions and sort of networks or systems we see these relationships in are a little bit different, more so a little more like memory system or default mode network, but the pattern is the same, right? Where better skills, better math fluency is related to less engagement during this control demanding task. So overall, in this first study, we see that controlled brain engagement is related to achievement in this group. We see these unique relations for reading and math, which are pretty interesting. We see some of these relationships in control-related systems, right, frontoparietal regions for the reading task. And one thing I want to really highlight here, and I want you to kind of hold this as we go through the talk, is that this is a non-learning context, right? There's nothing really lexical about this task. They're not doing reading, they're not doing math here. So even just the brain engaged in a domain general control demanding context still carries information, right, about how students are going to be doing in learning in an academic environment. So the control engagement here seems to be really kind of linked to learning in this group. Okay, so study one, we're really thinking about brain engagement, brain activation. In study two, we're moving from engagement to thinking about brain systems and coordinated activation or functional connectivity. So how are brain regions that we're mapping out responsive to these tasks related to each other? So again, we have these brain regions that we map out with these three tasks, and we can think about sort of activity in these regions, and we can think about activity in these regions changing together, right? So when you gauge one control region, you gauge another control region, and we can use correlations to estimate that, right? And we call that functional connectivity, coordinated activation between brain regions. We can think about control regions being functionally connected to each other. We can also think about cross-system connectivity and coordination, right? So we could think about how do control systems relate to reading, how do control systems relate to math, and we can really build this out to think about how do all these regions relate to each other. And that's the question that drove the second study, is functional connectivity of reading, math, and control systems related to achievement in this group. And to get at this, so we have these three tasks that we are mapping out these regions in, so the reading, math, and control regions. And so I talked a little bit ago about this remarkable kind of variability in experience and use of English in this group. So in order to really capture that, we decided to not just sort of take the same regions for everyone and apply them to everyone's brain. We went to dig into the brains at an individualized level and really capture in each EL's brain, where does your brain really respond to this reading, math, and control task? So the way we did that is we started with these group level regions of interest that are sort of average across everybody. And then we use that to constrain where we look. And then for each person, we sort of identified within this set of regions, where are you most responsive? So that looks something like this. So for this person, this is where their regions of interest lie. And it looks different for another participant. So you can see, because we use these group regions to constrain it, right? The regions are roughly in the same place, but the sort of size varies person to person, and even whether or not a region is represented can vary person to person. And I'm happy to talk more afterwards about some of the details of how we did this. And when we look at across sort of everyone, so this is everyone's reading regions laid on top of each other, you can see that there's variability in where it is represented, right? So the yellow kind of spots in the middle are hot spots where lots of people have activation, a representation of this region, but there is sort of spread and variability across people, and we're able to capture that with this approach. So we take an individual's regions of interest here, and then we apply them to resting state data. So this is when students are in the scanner looking at a plus sign, not doing anything in particular. And the reason we look at the resting state when we think about functional connectivity and organization is regions that act together, have a kind of historical coactivation, are going to show more similar patterns of activity at rest as well. So this is sort of reflective of historical coactivation, what has been going on, how are regions kind of historically organized together. So we take these time courses, we take these regions, apply them to resting state, and then we get these time courses of brain activity across the resting state for each region, correlate all those with each other, right? So now we have a correlation matrix where each cell is representing that functional connection between two regions. And then we can apply graph metrics to this that give us sort of global properties of how these regions are related to each other. What is the sort of pattern of functional connectivity among all of these brain regions, or a subset of them? So the question, again, underlying the study is functional connectivity of these reading, math, and control systems related to achievement in this group. And we found that it is. So when we look at the connectivity of all of these regions together, so control, math, reading, we see a positive relationship. So more functional connectivity between all these regions means better reading fluency in this group. We also looked at just the control regions themselves and found a similar pattern. So not only is it about sort of how all these regions are similar to each other, but how sort of tightly linked are the control regions within themselves. And we see stronger connectivity within control regions is related to reading as well. This is a reading comprehension measure. So we see both sort of kind of how control systems are functionally similar or functionally connected to reading and math regions, as well as within themselves related to reading skills. When we looked at the math skills, we saw effects that were in a similar direction, but they weren't as strong for the math. So if anyone has thoughts about that, I'm happy to chat about that as well. So from these two studies, we gleaned that control brain function really is linked to achievement and these English learners. We see this both when we look in a control demanding but non-learning context, that engagement is related to their sort of out of scanner reading and math skills. We also see that functional connectivity of the brain at rest of these control systems and learning systems is related to reading skills. And one thing that the second study really highlighted to us is that these individualized approaches could be really useful when we're trying to especially think about groups with kind of varied abilities or very developmental challenges. Thinking about measuring the brain in a more individual specific way could be really powerful to understanding groups like this. Okay, so far, hopefully I've presented some evidence that is convincing that control engagement, the control brain, is related to achievement and learning in this group. How unique is this to English learners, right? So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about evidence that was not from English learners about how engagement of control regions during reading is related to achievement. We know executive functions are related to achievement. So does this finding of cognitive control of brain activity relate to reading or achievement in other groups, in other contexts? And now I'm going to take you through a little bit of data that suggests that not always. So there is some specificity, some nuance in this, and I'll talk to you through some data from our group that suggests that. So the two studies I just talked about were part of the Texas Center for Learning Disabilities and those studies ran from about 2017 to 2022. the iteration of the center before that was focused on fourth grade struggling readers, non-EL specific. So this is just sort of fourth grade struggling readers in general in Central Texas. And similar, so these students also went school-based intervention for reading comprehension. Again, I'm not going to talk about the intervention at all. I'm talking about sort of brain data collected pre-intervention. And these struggling readers did 2 tasks in the scanner. So they also did a reading task. This was a sentence comprehension task. So they're reading sentences and saying whether or not they're sensible. And then they also did a control demanding task. This time it was an inhibition task. So this was the stop signal task where they were presented with arrows pointing left or right. And so they have to push left, right, left, right. And sometimes a X pops up over the arrow and they have to not press anything. So really tapping into that kind of motor inhibition of a prepotent response. So when we looked at the reading task in this group, we found that reading brain activity in control regions was related to reading skills. And this is exactly the data that I showed you earlier, right? So in fourth grade, both struggling and non-struggling readers in the dorsal anterior cingulate, a control region, there is a relationship between engagement of this control region and reading while they're doing a reading task. We also found that during the reading task, brain activity during that task separated students who are going to go on and improve from a future intervention and those who wouldn't. So sort of a marker for response to intervention. We saw this so this is not a control region per se, right? This is the right fusiform, so a sort of homolog to the visual word form area, but we did see some of these effects in domain general control regions as well. So kind of overall takeaway from this work is that while struggling readers are in the scanner reading, their brain is in control regions and in other regions is related to both their reading skills and their response to intervention. So, of course, right, but we're still interested in this study as well in the role of control, and do we see effects during control? Do we see this related to achievement? And the answer was no. So while these students were doing the stop signal task, this inhibition task, activity was not related to their reading skills. Activity did not separate improvers from non-improvers when it came to response to intervention. So from these set of studies, we sort of concluded that inhibition brain function is not related to achievement, and that control brain regions and control engagement is important for reading, is important for achievement, but specifically in the reading context. We didn't see that relationship in this just domain general control demanding context. And this fit with work that shows that if you do sort of broad executive function intervention and try to train those up, that doesn't really necessarily change achievement broadly in students. So our thinking around this was that it's really about how control systems are engaged for the service of learning, for the service of reading, that we really see those relationships. But a few years later, right, we do this work in the ELs, and we do find that cognitive flexibility brain function is related to achievement, right? A domain general flexibility task, we do see relationships between engagement during that task and their achievement, both reading and math. And we're also finding resting state functional connectivity related to achievement in this group as well. So what do we do with this? Clearly, there is some specificity, some nuance here, right? There's some specificity in the relationship and the role of cognitive control for learning. So where is that specificity? It's possible that it differs by student, right? So one study is a group of mostly monolingual students. Another study is a group of English learners. We also have age specificity, right? So one study is done in fourth graders, another study is done in middle schoolers, so sixth and seventh graders. So those could be places, those could be moderators, right, of sort of this relationship between control and learning. another important thing to consider here is the domain of cognitive control, or the executive function that we're tapping, right? So one study, the study in ELs, is getting at cognitive flexibility, which we did think would be particularly useful and kind of related to learning in the ELs, while the other one is looking at inhibition. And there is some work suggesting that cognitive flexibility is a better predictor of reading skills than inhibition is. But the last thing I sort of want to show you today is some newer data that we have that's kind of digging into this question of different domains of cognitive control, kind of pitting cognitive flexibility versus inhibition, and asking questions about differences in the brain while they're engaged in these different types of tasks. So we have a study that we are currently about to submit. And the question really driving this work is, how does brain organization is similar or different during different control demanding tasks? So for this study, we have a group of youth ages 8 to 18 across a couple different studies. And we have in each person 3 different control demanding tasks. So we have a cognitive flexibility task, right? And that's going to look familiar to you. It's a task I just talked about. The inhibition task is going to look familiar as well. And then we also have a working memory shape and back task where they have to decide whether the shape they're seeing is the same as 1 before in a 1 back condition or 2 before in a 2 back condition. And for this study, we're thinking about the brain globally. We're also thinking about specific networks, and we're thinking about how do patterns of functional connectivity across the brain differ across these control tasks. And this work is really inspired by sort of Akira Miyake's kind of take on executive functions and this idea of unity and diversity, right? So there are things that are similar across executive functions, and also there are things that are unique and separable. So what does the brain look like across different executive function tasks? How similar, how different are they from each other? And what we're finding is that there are differences in patterns of functional connectivity across these 3 domains. So here I'm showing a measure called global efficiency. So this is a whole brain metric of functional connectivity that gets at how integrated are brain regions with each other. How efficiently can information or can you sort of travel from brain region to brain region based on the strength of those functional connections. And what we're finding is that these tasks do differ from each other, right? So we are finding that, interestingly, working memory and inhibition look a little more similar to each other, but they both look quite different, both from cognitive flexibility and from the resting state. And in thinking about the sets of studies I just told you about, right, I want to highlight the difference between inhibition and flexibility, and irrespective of sort of learning academic stuff at the moment, just the brain organization underlying these 2 tasks is different. So we see differences in whole brain integration between flexibility and inhibition. So this idea of specificity or nuance when it comes to the domain, I think could be really interesting here. So does different brain organization, does that relate different brain organization of the inhibition task versus the flexibility task? Could that be a clue into these different relationships between brain function and learning in this group and in students really broadly? Okay, so to wrap things up, sort of I'll remind you of our first kind of set of results from those first 2 studies that we talked about, where for English learners, so these students with particular unique learning needs, we do see that there is a role for control when it comes to learning. So both during a control demanding task, right, brain engagement is related to learning. We also see when we think about organization, functional connectivity, historical co-activation, systems that support both learning and control, and the relationships between those is related to reading as well in this group. And again, I want to highlight, I'm really excited about this individualized approach and sort of bringing it into more aspects of my work. And I think there's sort of a broader call in cognitive neuroscience to think about using different methods, using more data, using ways to kind of square the fact that everyone's brain is different and get more precise, more individualized in the way we think about the brain. And I think for those of us who think about youth, developmental challenges, development in general, getting at that individualized piece, I think could be really exciting and informative. There are some open questions here too, right? So I gave you a little bit of my thinking around it, but we still, I don't think, have squared this away fully. So what are the specific parameters of this relationship between control and learning, right? We talked about, is it about the student? Is it about the cognitive control domain? Is it about the approach? Is it about connectivity versus activity? What are ways that we can really tease this apart? And then I think a better understanding of that can answer this question of what do we do with that, right? So once we kind of uncover the specific parameters of how and when and for who, what type of control is really important for learning for students, how can we then use that to sort of maybe drive the brain, drive control systems in learning relevant ways to ultimately sort of help support students with different learning challenges. All right, so I want to thank everyone who was involved in this work, a lot of my PhD lab, my advisor, Jessica Church, all the families that came in, all of our funding mechanism. I want to thank my lab here at FSU for their support, and thank you all for being here today, for your attention, for the invitation. And maybe or maybe not, this seems like the perfect time to come to spend 5 years in the United States and in Florida, but I am recruiting graduate students for my lab. So if any of this work sounds exciting, we're having a lot of fun here exploring those questions. So I'd be happy to chat with anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, this is such an interesting talk, right? This really caught my interest when you presented a little, like a fraction of this in at Imbes. And, I really love the, the kind of interconnected, like systems perspective you're taking, and this kind of individualized approach is so interesting. So I'm really glad to have the chance to ask you some more questions. There is a question in the chat already. But while I give other people a chance to ask, I'm gonna go ahead and ask one of my big questions, which is so based on my understanding, this sort of lower activation of the cognitive control system in more proficient learners means that, or could mean that sort of the reading system itself, or whatever system is doing the task of reading or maths or whatever, is working more efficiently, so it doesn't need so much control going on top. Is that sort of your understanding? Is that consistent with what your narrative is?
Yeah, I think that is our thinking on it as well. It's sort of it's a more efficient system, maybe even in the domain general context, right? If you need to drive control less, potentially that means the system's a little more efficient, and then potentially that means there is better reading, right? So I think the activation results where you see like fewer sort of or less activity in these peaks paired with the stronger connectivity at rest, those fit nicely together, right? So the system is potentially more linked up, more efficient. There's maybe fewer regions that have to really kind of drive the brain, drive the system when it's needed for control. And that is helpful in the service of learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of drill down on that a little bit more, I was very interested by the cognitive flexibility finding in the older students, because it was linked to obviously better achievement. And I'm quite interested in cognitive flexibility in learning because there is evidence that it can be linked to sort of better learning in general because of how it relates to how they're using the information and how they apply learning across contexts and task switching. And it sort of links to all these practical skills. I don't know if that's a question as such, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that cogflex in the older students, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Definitely, there's evidence already, right? That flexibility I mentioned. There's a few studies that show that flexibility has a unique role in predicting achievement, sort of above and beyond some of the other executive functions. And I think you're exactly right. Like I think it's about sort of attentional flexibility, being able to switch tasks, being able to maybe switch between sort of outwardly and inwardly focused attention. So yeah, the age thing is interesting, and that's something are we haven't fully been able to tease apart yet because we sort of have the one task in the eighth graders, we have the one task in the fourth graders, but we do have currently being collected, I think close to done, a group of non-EL students who are the same age doing a flexibility, doing like the same tasks, middle schoolers. So that will help us sort of tease apart the kind of EL. Is it EL specific or is it sort of more general of students this age?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's possible that these effects are maybe stronger when the students are a little older because the kind of their control, their flexibility is maybe a little more gelled, a little more developed, where
Yeah.
they are able to kind of use those skills a little more.
Yeah.
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 We have a little
It's
bit. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say it's like that developmental trajectory thing, the sort of
Right.
cascade, because if they're slightly better, then they're going to keep getting better, aren't they? And if they're slightly worse, then they're going to keep
Yeah.
getting worse. Yeah, sorry, interrupted you. I thought you'd come to a stop.
No, I was thinking about in this data, so we have a pretty wide age range, and we see some interesting. We looked at sort of how similar your brain is when you're doing the flexibility task and the inhibition task, or the flexibility and the working memory task, and how that is related to age. And we see that as children get older, their brains look actually more similar while they're doing these tasks. And that I think that could potentially speak to just sort of EF maturation
Yeah,
broadly. And but I think there's something interesting to think about there, sort of as your brain is in this more kind of maybe pre-configured control state, is that easier to then enact for learning?
yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you. I will stop hogging you and I will let the people in the chat have a go as well. So Ontai says, great research work. My question is, how does the student consciously or knowingly engage his or her cognitive control process to
Ooh,
improve reading or math skills? That's a very practical
yeah.
question.
I
Yeah. And
think,
how can the instructor guide them? Yeah.
yeah, that I think that is the question, right? Like that right here, this last point. I think I can speculate on some things, right? So I think, especially when we think about flexibility, I think so I think there's a kind of a spectrum here, right? You don't want to have like students having to task switch too much where they feel like they can't stay on task. But I think there could be interesting ways to weave in kind of control demanding pieces into curriculum, into lessons. So we could think about if, especially one thing I'm really interested in this kind of switch between kind of outwardly directed attention and inwardly directed attention, which I think flexibility has a role in. So one thing you can think of is potentially kind of lessons is sort of where you check in with yourself pretty frequently. So you're reading and then you're sort of like, where am I and where's my understanding, where's my knowledge, and then like sort of switch back between those types of attentions. Yeah, But I think that's a big question, because I think, sort of, as I alluded to, we know that just sort of like broad executive function training, not in the service of learning, doesn't seem to do a ton, especially maybe for students who are really struggling, but not for students broadly. So yeah, that's a big, great question.
No, thank you. I think that's some interesting practical advice there. So Esma has a question. Thank you for this great presentation. Do you think, can we think this cognitive controllability of English learners from the perspective of language flexibility? That's
Yeah.
interesting. And actually, there's a second question. So maybe answer that one first, and then we'll come to the next one.
Yeah. So uh, if by language flexibility, you're sort of thinking about the ability to sort of shift back and forth between using different languages, or maybe you are using one language but retrieving knowledge in another language,
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why when we were designing the study for the ELs, we were sort of kind of honing in on cognitive flexibility, because I do think that ability is so important.
Yeah. So the next question is, can this be generalizable to other bilinguals? Which I actually think is a really interesting question, because you're looking specifically at, mainly Spanish speaking first
Yeah.
language students. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I would expect so. I think so. We could think of, I guess you could think of sort of two things here, right? You could think of the flexibility, and then you can also think of like control in terms of like effort. And so I think that flexibility is going to likely be predictive of, you know, things that are language related. So sort of like switching back and forth between languages, or reading, doing something in maybe a non-dominant language. Even if you don't have that non-proficient piece, I do think that flexibility and control is going to be relevant there as well. There potentially that process is less effortful in a sort of fluent bilingual, but I still think that it would be important and probably predict some sort of aspect, I think, of probably use of the second language.
Yeah. Going back to sort of Esma's first question about, cognitive control and language flexibility, it links to another point I sort of noted down, which is this, slightly contentious area of bilingual advantage. So this idea that being
Yeah.
bilingual improves cognitive skills, cognitive control in various ways. What do you think your work sort of speaks to in that bilingual advantage kind of sphere?
Yeah. I think with this work, it's pretty hard to tease that out, because these students they're not just bilingual. They have a lot of other challenges. So we did a little bit of work where we looked at sort of performance on the flexibility task in this group compared to other students around their age. And they don't do better. But we cannot say that is because there is or isn't this bilingual advantage, because these are students who, as I mentioned sort of like early on in the talk, have these other really unique challenges, right? They're in schools that are very low resourced. A lot of them come from, backgrounds and homes that are low resourced. So, I think it's hard to tease that apart
Yeah.
in this group.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to another of my sort of bigger questions, which was about this SES and
Yeah.
disadvantage, and whether there was any way of teasing it apart. Did you include any control measures or anything that could have done that in these studies?
Yeah, we unfortunately don't have a great SES measure in this group.
Yeah,
We didn't have a really consistent measure that we got from everyone.
yeah,
But I mean, overwhelmingly, this group in particular, not all ELs, but this group were all from, schools that are super under-resourced, and
yeah,
there wasn't yeah. So, and in Texas in general, I think the like ELs, I think like something north of 85% are from
yeah,
uh, lower SES backgrounds. So we didn't have the data to tease that apart, particularly on a group, but we were pretty confident that overall this is a pretty low SES group, but there probably is some variability, and that is a factor that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. To be honest, I think it's quite hard to tease apart, even if you do have
Yeah,
measures, so
yeah.
it's not a criticism at all. So we've got a couple more minutes left. So anybody who wants to get any last minute questions in, send them now. In the meantime, while we've got you here, it might be nice to hear a little bit more about the method you mentioned for this individual localization that you did.
Yeah, sure. So let me pull up a little slide related to that. So this is modeled off of work from Nancy Canwisher's group. It's sort of group constrained subject specific method. So we started with group maps. So sort of just like group maps from the tasks, sort of task greater than baseline for these 3 tasks. And then we take an individual's map of activity, unthresholded or low thresholded, and we basically, so the individual reading activity will be in the green, the group ROIs are in the blue, and we use those group ROIs sort of mask out. So we're just looking at individual activity within the group ROIs, but we're able to only get voxels that are engaged for that person. So and for some people, so we took 10, like the 10 biggest reading, math, and control ROIs. So some people didn't even have certain ROIs represented. And in some people, sort of an ROI would be split into smaller ones. So we allowed size to vary, we allowed representation to vary, but we did sort of keep it constrained within this group map. I think ultimately to be able to make we feel like it's easier to make inferences if we do keep it constrained in that way. And then we took the data from, so these analyses were done in volumetric space, and we took the data into individualized surface space. So not only are we sort of getting the activity sort of represented at the individual level, we're also getting it sort of mapped better to that individual's brain structure, because we're allowing that to vary person to person as well. And so what we end up with is 30 regions, so 10 of each for each person. They, again, are group constrained, but vary in size, vary in like where it's exactly represented. So all of the functional connectivity analyses, as long as you have the same sort of number of regions per person, it all works well. And can bring up this too. This is, so I know I showed this in the talk, but we kind of look at the spread and we can see, I think it's pretty cool to think about how we have these like centers to some extent. The control systems have maybe the most well-established centers, but we also see a lot of spread that we're able to capture with this method.
I find it absolutely fascinating. It's so interesting to hear you talk about how you did it. It's incredible. So we are coming up to 5. So I just want to say thank you so much again to Tehila, and you deserve a massive round of applause for such an engaging and interesting talk. So yes, and thank you to everybody for being here and sharing this with us as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it. Thank you, Tehila. I will stop the recording.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great questions. Really wonderful group, wonderful
Thank
time.
you.
So I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. It turns out I cannot stop the recording. I've somehow lost my host privileges. So I think we'll just have to
Have to all leave.
leave. We'll just have to leave and hope it stops.